Rahubat, Musba'u, and greetings to our YouTube family out there. We're back again. While it's been a while since we did our last lecture, that we uploaded our last lecture. This lecture that we're doing today is something that we talked about from the previous lecture that we did. The last lecture that we posted was the part 4 of the African Science of Existence, aka the Ghost God, what is 3 ether. And so this is our current lecture. Now, for those who are new to our channel, and if this is one of the first times you're watching our lecture, I say greetings again. Welcome. My name is Peti Sina Tebtu Re'e, and I've been a 30-year student teacher of the profound doctrine of the Master Teacher, known to us as Panabab Yananin, also known as Dr. Malachi Z.K. York, who has been teaching us the right knowledge, what we call Wu-Sabat or Wu-Nuwaupu, which stands for sound, right, reasonability. It's an ancient African culture. In fact, it's the original ancient African culture that we've been teaching. And that culture is based on our ancestors who made decisions based on sound, right, reasonability, based on the principles of Ma'at, because our ancestors made decisions based on the principles of Ma'at. And we had a very advanced culture that we gotten away from. And we argue that the problems that black people are dealing with in the world today is because they're not making decisions based on sound reasoning. They're not making decisions based on sound reasoning. And so we're saying if we get back to making decisions like that once again, then the problems that we're seeing among us as black people around the world would disappear. And this is what we as students of Wu-Sabat are dedicated to solving that problem. We're dedicated to teaching you guys out there how to make better decisions. Now, another thing, a project that I'm a part of is NoopooCC.com. So you guys see that on our site. If you type in NoopooCC.com, it'll take you to our own social engine, as well as our website, which is NoopooH.org. Okay? And our website is about, NoopooH.org is about promoting black consciousness, promoting black concepts when it comes to business ideas. And so I do ask everybody to take their time out to go to our site, look what we're doing. But I reiterate, we ask people to become members of our social engine, NoopooCC.com. Like Facebook, it's a social engine, although it doesn't have the bells and whistles of Facebook. And our social engine is fee-based, because unlike Facebook, well, they have millions of dollars to back them. And we're asking you guys to make this social engine work. And it can only work with the support of the people. So this is one of the reasons what we're stressing. Also, I like to make this clear. Whenever we do a lecture, we try our best. We definitely try our best to be as accurate as we possibly can, but we're not infallible. We can and do make mistakes. And if anybody sees any errors that we may make, by all means, do not hesitate to let us know, to contact us. You can definitely make comments, and we encourage people to make comments, but we also encourage people to watch our lectures more than once, because we usually are dealing with subject matter that's new to the general public, because a lot of people are not that familiar with our doctrine, including students. I recommend watching more than once because it helps for clarity. But again, I'm not the only student that's out here teaching our ancient culture of Wu-Sabat. There are many of us across the globe, and we're all here doing the same thing, trying to get the truth to our people so that we can make better decisions. Now, in getting started with this particular lecture, this lecture is called The Races of Nature by Nature, aka what is a human being? I repeat, the races of nature by nature, aka what is a human being? Okay, there's some keywords that you're gonna need to know in order for this lecture to make sense, okay? First thing you have to understand, these keywords. 1, what is the mind? You must understand what is the mind. Now, we wrote a book on that called The Mind Scroll. For those who have the benefit of having that book or reading that book, I highly recommend reread it. And for those who don't, I highly recommend for you to read it, okay? The Mind Scroll. So the first key word for this lecture to comprehend it is you must understand what is the mind. Next is vibration. What is vibrations? The next key word is frequency, right? The next key word is sound. You must understand what sound is. The next key word is color. We must understand what color is. And the last key word is matrix. What is a matrix? Those keywords are very important to understanding this subject matter that we're dealing with, which is what? The races of nature by nature, aka what is the human being? This is a very important question that everyone must know. What is the human being? Okay? Now, here's the thing. You cannot comprehend the races of nature by nature unless you comprehend these words. These words explains existence. These words explain all there is to know. These words explain the nature of nature, for all is mind in its many different forms, which is what existence is all about, which are the differences that makes a difference. Okay? The key is the differences within natural and unnatural nature, which is why there are different races of nature by nature, because nature is what creates the differences so that you would know difference within nature. Or the question would be, what would be the point of existence if all was the same? So this is the basic building blocks and essence of how nature creates. It creates in differences. And it's very important to understand or comprehend these differences. And today we're going to talk about what are there races in nature? Are there different races of nature by nature? And what are those differences all about? Because people are constantly asking, they say, well, it's just the human race. And we beg to differ. It's a little bit more involved than that. So I want to recommend a couple of more books. I already said The Mind Scroll, right? I recommend reading. We also put out a book called The Science of Healing. The Science of Healing. So you see that book. I highly recommend that book for you guys to read that. Hopefully those books are on scribes for those who may not know. Okay? And then you have another book called The Wisdom of Tahuti that the master teacher had wrote. So I highly recommend those three particular books, okay, for this discussion. Now, next. Why isn't this, next question, next point is, are there races on Earth by way of nature? So that's the question. Are there races on Earth by way of nature? Or is it just the human race, as you hear a lot of people out there talk about? Are there different races by nature? The answer to that question is yes. There are three races of people on Earth, which are the woolly hair, black African race, right? So all those people who have woolly hair by nature, who are descendants of Africans, right? Black Africans, that's a particular race, the African race, right? And then you have the Asian races, which include your Indian peoples and your Orientals. So those are your Asiatic races, okay? And then you have the last race, which is the Caucasian race, who are identified with either having blonde hair and blue eyes, or red hair and green eyes, or dark hair and dark eyes, which are all children from Europe. So the Caucasian race predominantly lives in Europe for the most part, right? The Asian races live in Asia, and everyone knows where the African race pretty much originate. Now, all other peoples on Earth are a mixture of the three root races, such as you have the Middle Eastern Arabs, right? Their mixture. You have the Latinos of South and Central America. You have North and South Native Americans, and all others that does not group into the three root races are a mixture of the primary three root races. Now, DNA test proves that the world's peoples are mixed with the 3 root races that all originally, by way of genetics, come from the African race, who are the source of all peoples on earth. So the genetic reality, or I should say the genetic fact, is that all humanity originally comes from the African race. Okay? All humanity originally comes from the African race. Very important point. But now, here's the next thing. Scientists are now learning how humans are different from animals by decoding genes which are only unique to humans, such as the gene called HAR1. So you guys see that on the screen, HAR1, right? The HAR1 gene, which they claim develops the brain, which is what makes humans so different from the animal kingdom. So this is very important, this HAR1 gene, okay? Now, I want to refer you guys to an article. There's an article in, it's called The Scientific American, and this article that came out in 2012, okay? It's a magazine called Scientific American, and I'm quoting, and here's a quote from a scientist. It turns out that where DNA substitutions occur in the genome, rather than how many changes survive overall, can matter a great deal. In other words, you do not need to change very much of the genome to make a new species. So what does that mean? That means what scientists now know, if that there's a slight variation in the genetic, a very small slight variation, that will produce a new species. I repeat, scientists know if there's a slight variation in genetic code, that will produce a new species, okay? And this is what we're trying to explain, how the different races came about. Because we all say all of humanity comes originally from the African race. But not everyone looks like the African race today. So the question is, how did the differences come about? And what we're saying is the different races came about due to a reality that there have been slight alterations in the genetics, very slight, that produce these different species of the human family, okay? Now, I also recommend some other data. Let's see. There's a book we put out, which is Actual Facts, number 13. I recommend that. It's called Nuwaupu Ontologies of Time. If you go to page 23, paragraph 63 through 66, and this basically goes into the origins of each race. Okay, this particular book that we put out, it goes into the origin of each race. You know, something else I know I've talked about before is if anyone takes the time out to look at the Olympics. If anyone takes the time out to look at the Olympics, the opening games, and if you look at the opening games, like if you look at I think it was the 2016, what was the last Olympics we did? 2016, right? If you look at the 2016 Olympics, and you see all these people from all these different countries, right? But if you pay attention, what you'll notice, you're only really gonna see 3 different races of people.
About 4 different types of looks.
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. Pay attention to the Olympics, because these different people will come from different nations, but being a part of a nation does not mean you're a part of a race. I repeat, being a part of a nation does not mean you're a part of a race. So let's go on. Next, if all people originally come from the African, then why are human beings of these so-called different races so different? Right? If all people originally come from the African, then why are human beings of these so-called different races so different? Answer. Life is about energy. It's important. Life is about the mind, the mental, right? Vibrations, sound, color, geometric shapes, or aka what we call matrices. This is why I told you, in order to comprehend this subject matter, you must understand those key words we talked about. It's very important to understand those key words. Next, humans are made of 3 parts. You have solids, you have liquid, and you have gas. Okay? So you have the flesh. That's the solid part of the human being. Okay? Liquid, the blood. And then the gas. What is the gas part? The mind. Your mind is nothing but gas particles, the electrons. And that's what makes up the human being. Very important to know this. Next, the races of human beings are so different because the human being is an incarnated spirit being occupying a physical material body, which is the cause of the uniqueness of each race, such as black people's skills in dancing, singing, and sports like no other race on earth. So what we're saying is this. In order to comprehend the races and why there are different races, what we first have to comprehend is, well, what is a human being? What is a human being? Right? And what we always taught is that a human being is an incarnated spirit being. The human being is an incarnated spirit being. Now let me go on. What does that mean? All human beings are made up either 4 or 3 parts, which are the mind. Every human being has a mind, the mental, we call the mental. But then, every human being has a ka, what we call the ka, which is a spirit. Okay? So that's another part. Then you have what is called the ba, and that's called the soul. That's another part. And then you have the khatat, and that's called the physical body. So those are the 4 parts that make up the human being. The mind, the soul, the spirit, and the physical body. Now, unfortunately, most humans, all they're familiar with is their physical body. And then they realize that they have a mind. But the question between a soul and a spirit, that confuses people. Because most people, when you hear about those things, that comes from religious theology. So from a scientific point of view, European or Caucasian scientists doesn't deal with that subject matter. Okay? But let's go on. Now, the African are the only human beings that has a ba, or soul, because the soul equals what we call the sun, which means that the African origin is very different from the origins of all other races, as shown by our unique woolly hair. It's a well-known fact that most people understand that we as African people will say we're children of the sun. Well, I'm here to tell you that statement is not a figurative statement. It's an actual literal statement.
How could that be literal?
The only way to comprehend that is to comprehend what is the human being made of. And the next thing you have to comprehend, well, does the human being have a spirit? And that's the dominant essence of what a human being is. And then the question is, well, what is a spirit? And the answer to that question, spirit is nothing but energy. A spirit is nothing but energy. So, because you have to ask the question, well, when someone physically dies, that physical body isn't operating that body any longer, but what animated the body when it was alive? And we argued that it's a spirit. Now, well, how do you know that? We're going to get into that. So let's see. The African origin is from the realm, what we call the realm of Nuwaupu. So all those who watched our lectures, our last 4 lectures we did on the African science of existence, I highly recommend you guys watch that. If you haven't watched those lectures, I know it's long, but it's a very important subject matter that we go into this, okay? And so we teach that the African origin is from the realm of Nuwaupu. All other races of humans on the planet are from the realm of Zupu. Now, in order for you to understand what that means, you're going to have to watch those lectures, because I'm not going to explain that. Now, let's move on. I have some things we need to refer to. First, I want to recommend, this is a a lecture that the master teacher, Dr. Malachi York, did back in the 80s, where he addressed this very subject matter. And it's called The Angelic Descendants. So please listen to this lecture where he's going to explain that the human being is not just a physical body, but also has a spirit and a soul. So listen to that.
Listen, you said we're angels, and we're also Nubian. So we have fallen from grace too, right?
I don't understand the question.
You don't understand the question?
No, I understand we are angels and I understand we are Nubian.
Yeah, what you said?
And maybe I'll do it this way. It says in Genesis that the Almighty created man of the dust of the ground and breathed into man the breath of life, right, and man became a living soul.
Right.
The Nubian part of you is the physical composition, the flesh.
Okay.
And the angelic part of you is the spirit. The combination of the spirit and the flesh gives birth to the soul.
I see.
Okay, so now you heard the master teacher explain this subject matter about a spirit and a soul. Okay, I also have some other things that I recommend you guys to that will help you with this subject matter. It's a book we put out. It's called The Actual Facts Genetic Kiss, and you guys will see that up there. And then there's another book I highly recommend to help you with this subject matter. It's called What is Spirit and Soul? And you see that book. And I do refer you guys to look at pages from page 2 to page 6. And it explains the difference between a soul and a spirit. Okay? So let's move on. Next point. There are 3 different types of spirits that incarnate into the human body. There are 3 types of spirits that incarnate into the human body. Now, what are they? Number 1, the black African has a non-ether spirit. Number 2, the Asiatics have a 3-ether spirit. Excuse me, I'm sorry. The Asiatics have a what we call a 6-ether spirit, and the Caucasian race has a 3-ether spirit. All right. So the African race, who us having a non-ether spirit, imagine a black gas. Imagine a black gas, and that's a non-ether spirit that activates the African body. Okay? And as far as the Asiatic races having a 6-ether spirit, imagine an amber light gas. An amber light. You see that, we talked about this in our previous lectures, you see that amber light, or aka orange, that the Hindus, they're priests, they're spiritualists, they wear this orange robe. You see the Asiatics, the Buddhists, they wear this orange robe. That represents their spirit energy. It's an orange, well, in essence, it looks like the electron. When you see a picture of the electron, which is orange light, that's a gas. That's a 6-ether gas. And then you have ghosts, which is 3-ether spirit. And everyone's familiar with ghosts. Ghost is white. And that's a 3-ether spirit. And each spirit represents, the spirit force of each race. So each spirit represents the spirit force of each race. So let's move on. Now, every one of the 3 different spirit beings vibrate on different frequencies, which are the causes of the differences. So the reason why human beings look different on the outside is what we're saying is because the spirit energy is different. And that's what changes the genetics. So it is the spirit inside that makes the difference. That's the key. It is the spirit inside that makes the difference, that alters the genetics that produces a different race. So let's move on. Now, the reasons why we know as fact that human beings are spirit beings incarnating into human bodies is because one is we like to tell people about the mirror test. Something we talk about numerous of times. This is a test that anyone can do and prove to themselves, because here's the reality. Unintelligence cannot create intelligence. So the question is, how do we know that we have a spirit, right? How do we know that we're mental beings with a spirit and not just physical bodies, as some Western scientists like to claim? And I always recommend people doing a mirror test. Anyone can do this. It's very simple. Go to the mirror and ask yourself the simple question: what came first? What you see in the mirror, your image, or the thought that made you walk to the mirror? Now, if you acknowledge that it was the thought that preceded the physical body, then if that's the case, if that's true, that your thoughts preceded the physical body, then that's a confession you existed before the physical body. Now, how do we know that's a fact? Well, simple. Because every human being has thoughts. And the question is, well, what is thoughts made of? Because your physical body is made of cells, molecules, and atoms. Well, what is the human thought made of? Thoughts are made of electrons, subatomic particles. We know that when they do it, what they call a CAT scan, when people go to the hospital, and all the brain scans that now scientists are doing, they now know that the thoughts they call brain synapses are electrical impulses. Electrons, that's your thoughts, is made up of electrons, electron particles. The electron existed before the atomic structure, the what we call the atom. Because the atom, with the first atom being the hydrogen atom is made up of electrons, which is subatomic particles. And so if your thoughts are subatomic particles, then the subatomic particles existed before the animated particles, such as your molecules and cells, cellular particles that make up the human body. Which means what? The mind had to exist before you had a material cellular body.
So I'm the same. I'm a physician, but I'm also fascinated with consciousness, which is, what is it that makes us into who we are? And one of the big questions we have right now in science, and for this century really, is how do brain processes possibly lead to this thinking, conscious being that makes us into who we are? And the general theory out there, of course it's not been proven, is that somehow brain cell processes somehow generate the mind, generate thoughts, generate who we are. But of course, there's no theory or even a plausible biological mechanism to account for how cells could even generate a single thought. So now, take that and bring it to the subject of what happens when we die. Well, after CPR was first discovered, about 15 years after that, a book was published which chronicled the experiences that people have had when they've been close to death or when their hearts had stopped. And essentially, these people all described feeling peaceful. They had a universal experience of feeling immense peace, seeing a bright, warm, welcoming light that draws them towards it, seeing a tunnel, seeing deceased relatives, sometimes welcoming them, sometimes describing seeing a being that was full of love and compassion that would take them through essentially an educational experience where they relived everything that they had done and they had said. and they judge themselves with this being's help, and often they describe going to a beautiful place, and at some point they realize they had to come back. And a small proportion of them also describe watching doctors and nurses working on them, and that's the classical near-death experience. Now, the explanations that were put forward in the 70s and 80s were that this is probably just simply lack of oxygen, a change in carbon dioxide level, and I think those are now antiquated with what we understand. So all we can say essentially is that, and the reason someone like me is interested in this is, in order for us to save a person and bring them back, we have to understand what happens to the brain, to the cells, after a person has technically died. But we can never forget there's a person there. So what does happen to their consciousness? And the evidence we have so far, and it's an emerging field, is that when a person has technically died, their brain flatlines, and no human experience should be happening at that time whatsoever. Paradoxically, 10 to 20% of people do come back and they report these incredible experiences.
How do we know that they're not recalling these experiences as they're coming back to consciousness, as they're coming out of the coma?
Well, that's a very good question, and that's been part of what I've been trying to study, and I will be releasing the results of our study in a month or so at a conference that, at the American Heart Association conference. But there are cases which don't support that, including what we found in our research, where essentially you can time the person's experience. You can see, they will tell you exactly what was happening to them 15 or 20 minutes into their cardiac arrest, rather than just the beginning or just the end where the brain function was coming back online again. So,
wait, I just want to follow up on this. You're saying they're reporting what that happened 15 or 20 minutes ago? They're reporting conversations that were heard? Or
they
what?
describe, so if you, a proportion of people will describe in incredible detail conversations, events that were happening, clothing, everything that happened. Except that, as far as we can tell, their brain at that time should be flatlined, and at best it's very, very disorganized. Yet they come back, it's not just a subjective experience of I saw a tunnel, I saw a light. They will say that, well, Dr. Mayer came in here and he was wearing a navy suit with a tie that was sort of brown and it had stripes on it, and he said, my God, this guy doesn't look very good, let's call his wife. And then my wife was crying. And in all this time, someone's doing this and someone's doing that. You know.
By the way, no resuscitation is ever going to be caught dead wearing a tie. Just so you know. All messed up.
Are you now talking about what are classically called out-of-body experiences? I mean, people, you know, the I don't know what, the entity hovering at the top of the ceiling, looking down at the operating table?
You should have invited me, I told you, Steve. So I hate that term, near-death experience, and out-of-body experiences. And I'll tell you why. Because they are labels that have been put forward since the 70s, which basically polarizes people into the religious people and the non-religious scientific people. And the fact is, we're dealing with a human experience. In the same way that 50 years ago, if you said that we could study love through science, they think it's non-scientific. But actually, we can. So the people that we study are not near death, and as far as I'm concerned, I don't like to call their experiences out-of-body experiences. They are people who have gone through death, as far as we understand it technically, and they have a unique experience. And part of that is having a sensation of seeing themselves and watching and hearing things. So they have consciousness present when consciousness should not be present, as far as our science tells us today.
The obvious conclusion that what we draw from this is that there's some aspect of the mind, of consciousness, that is not associated with a corresponding brain state.
Well, like I said, I mean, this is very much a subject that's early and just being studied. There haven't been many studies, but we have to be open to it. It's possible, like I said, there is enough anecdotal evidence and there are enough cases that have occurred that suggests that consciousness may continue when brain function has ceased. And to answer a point that...
And if your spirit is energy, like your mind, then your spirit had to exist before you had a material body. Not to mention, if your physical body existed before the mind, then the question is, how could that which is unintelligent create intelligence? Because intelligence comes with thought. So are we saying the bodies existed before there was thought? That's impossible. You can't have a physical manifestation without the mental manifestation, because you can't do anything physically first before you think about it. That's also impossible. So think on that, and let's move on. I want to refer some books for this subject matter also. We put out an actual facts number 31, and it's called Good and Evil. And I refer to go to pages 11 through 12, and it explains that all races have the genes of the African, but the differences are the spirits that activate the body that explains the differences. So I do recommend looking at that particular book. Also, I recommend going back to the other book we talked about, which is Actual Facts number 13. You guys see that on the screen? And this is the Nuwaupu Ontologists of Time. Go to page 25, paragraphs 72 to 74, and this explains how each race represents the 3 different ethers. We talked about those ethers before, okay, in the beginning, where we just in this particular topic. Also, go to Actual Facts number 27. This talks about this is called the Supreme Beings, or the Melanites, on page 39, paragraph 231. And this quote here: each people have their own inner and outer natures. Okay, so it talks about each race has their own distinct nature. So look at that particular book. And then I recommend Master's Secret. This is another book, number 4. This is Why No Help from Above. And go to page 2. Now you guys see that explains how each race vibrates on different frequencies that connect them to their ancestors. So that's the Master's Secrets, number 4. And then the last one I recommend is Actual Facts number 46, Intelligent Design, Divine Design, or Plot of Aliens. And go to page 27, and it explains here that each race had different spirit beings, aka ETs, that mixed in with them. And it goes into how you got the different races. So I highly recommend those books. Next point. People's spirits are people's personality, and people's personality creates people's culture. I repeat. People's spirits are people's personality, and people's personality creates people's culture. So, the spirit of a human being is the personality of the human being, which equals the everyday actions of that human being, which equals the human being's culture. So let me say that again. The spirit of a human being is the personality of the human being, which equals the everyday actions of that human being, which equals that human being's culture. Now, when you look at the different races of people of Earth, you see different behaviors, which is the nature of the spirit that rules that human body. Okay, so that's very important to understand, is that the differences in the humans is the different spirits, and different spirits have different personalities, which is the behavior, and that's what creates different cultures. Okay, so now when you look at the differences in cultures, for instance, right, when you look at how, let's say, the Caucasian people, how they live, how they rule today, and you analyze how African people, now this is the key, if you analyze how we as African people lived and ruled prior to 500 years ago, that's a very important point. You can't look at how we as black African people live today on Earth under colonization, because we've been altered. But if you look at our history prior to colonization, which means you got to go back 500 years ago, and then look at how we lived, you see a vast difference between our lifestyle and the European lifestyle. Okay? Because the European lifestyle 500 years ago is basically no different than it is today. It's pretty much the same. All right? So what are those differences? For instance, let's see. When you look at the European culture versus the African culture, you see the differences, such as the African culture was always based on how we, our diet was based on natural foods. Where now you see the European culture, their food sources is, unfortunately, just about everything they're producing now is artificially developed. So the African, our culture was about being more in harmony with nature. The European culture is really adverse to nature. That's why the complaint is about the industrialization, because of capitalism. People complaining that that they're destroying the earth. People are destroying the earth because of all this innovation, right? And so the question then comes, I mean, some people argue, well, this is the advancement of human beings, but do you advance human beings at the expense of destroying human beings and destroying the earth? I argue Africans don't have no such history, nor would we create and design a culture that's designed to destroy the earth and destroy humanity. And this is exactly what the European culture has done. That is what it is.
More than 1,000 years ago, there came to the highlands of East Central Africa the Watusi, a giant race who conquered the agricultural natives of the region now known as Rwanda. Today, still ruling over 2 million subjects who inhabit the rolling hills, the Watusi live in neat houses of clay and thatched straw. The family of Prince Muikarago are preparing for breakfast. One of their many Wahutu servants has brought water with young palm leaves for hand towels. Other servants on containers of food prepared in the nearby kitchen. Food for the Wahutu farmers, peas, bananas, all in clean wooden containers ready for serving. Members of the family are seated behind a low clay platform which on occasion serves as a fireplace. The refined features of Prince Muikarago bespeak his noble lineage as he chats with his son, Prince Kanamugiri, while Princess Mukaratesi attends her little daughter. Using the fireplace as a serving table, the servant places in wooden bowls for each member of the family the boiled rice, beans, peas, and bananas sliced with a bamboo knife. The little princess prefers bananas, fresh gathered from nearby gardens. Intimate relationship exists between father and son. The young prince will someday inherit the family properties, farmlands, servants, and cattle, in line with age-old practice among Watusi nobility. Today, with breakfast over, father and son are going out to inspect their cattle. It is only when the prince rises that we appreciate his height. More take leave of the prince's mother. They pass out of the thatched house, and, after farewell, out through a gate in the stockade which encloses the buildings. With her young daughter at her side, the princess takes up a morning activity, the weaving of an ornamental wall mat. This is made of reeds and grasses dyed in various colors. Such geometrical designs are characteristic of Watusi ornamentation of walls and clothing. Since cattle play such a prominent part in Watusi life, it is natural that the young prince's clay toys should represent the royal cows. This servant girl, the personal attendant of the mother, now requests that she inspect the broad trays of coffee drying in the sun, another feature of household routine and a part of the education of the young daughter. And then on to oversee the churning. The Watusi depend for their food chiefly upon dairy products, milk, curds, and butter. The churns are jugs of cleverly carved wood, scrupulously clean, and covered by cones of closely woven grasses. Meanwhile, Prince Muikarago and his son are inspecting one of the treasured royal herds. Cows with huge horns, often measuring 10 feet from tip to tip. The head herdsman has called attention to an ailing animal. The prince sends his son off to play with some comrades before he begins the incantations which are calculated to restore the cow to health. In company with other lads of the nobility, Prince Kanamogiri plays the game of Igoroso, much like backgammon, more familiar to us. This game is played only by members of the nobility.
When you look at basic principles of cultural living, in African culture, we had no concept of owning the earth. No one can own the earth. That's a vast difference between the European culture. Their whole culture is based around private property, owning the earth. How human beings can own the earth. Those are huge distinctions between how the African looked at running their societies versus how Europeans look at running their societies. Ownership. Africans is, you can't own the earth. The Europeans think they think they can own the earth, which is why they spent all their time in the last 500 years trying to conquer the earth. But
what do you say about people who say they do own the earth? They're controlling it. They got guns to...
No one can own the earth. Every human being dies. The earth is still going to be here. The only reason why they control the earth is through threat of death. They will kill people for trespassing on what they call their property, because they can't own the earth. The earth will always be, always was. Humans will come and they will go. The earth will be here. As Africans, we understood that principle. So we never thought to think that we can own the earth. And that's what we're trying to say. That is the difference between how they think versus how we think. We don't think like that now because we're under the colonial brainwashing that we've been under for the last 500 years, but we thought like that for thousands of years. Okay? And I can tell you right now, the European model is collapsing. It is collapsing. Just look at the chaos in the street with all this protesting. And what is this protesting about? Right? What is this protesting? You guys hearing about the killing of George Floyd? Why are people upset? Is it because of the one killing? No. It's about injustice. And the biggest problem of the injustice is what? Economic injustice. That's another difference between European culture and African culture. European culture believes in hoarding. That's why, what's that guy, Jeff Bezos from Amazon?
Yeah, Amazon CEO.
$100 billion? How can one person have $100 billion? All these starving, listen, the United States have enough money, there should be no poverty. There's enough wealth, enough food in the United States to feed everybody. There should be no hunger. How much food does restaurants throw away? Every day, they just throw away wasteful foods. How many vacant rooms are in hotels, motels, and vacant apartment buildings and homes that you have homeless? There's no reason to have homelessness. There's no reason to have unemployment. But when you create a capitalistic society about competition, you're going to have winners and losers. Because that's what this society is about. Again, it's adverse to African culture. We would never create a society that creates massive disenfranchisement of the large segment of the population. 1% of the people control everything, and the other 99% have to serve the 1%. That makes no sense. So again, we're different. I don't know what else to say about that. We're vastly different. Okay. And I just recommend, we talk about that in the other book I talked about before, Actual Facts Genetic Kiss. Study that particular book. We get into that subject matter. Next point. If the human being is an incarnated spirit being, then what happens when the races mix, and is that a good or bad thing? I repeat, if the human being is an incarnated spirit being, then what happens when the races mix, and is that a good or bad thing? Okay. Well, here's the point. Here's the answer. The human being is, as we taught by the master teacher, 33 1/3% from their mother, 33 1/3% from their father, and 33 1% their own personality. So that means you have the personality of your mother, you have the personality of your father, and you have your own distinct personality, which means you have traits from both parents, but you also have your individual traits, right? And you have your individual traits that you learn from your current culture. Which is why your behavior today would be kind of different than the behavior of your parents because of the culture. That makes sense? All right. And so that should be obvious. The differences between what the human being is made of, a composite of their parents, right? That's a genetic fact. So, but here's the point. When races mix their blood and have children, the result is a mixed child having 30 or more spirits that occupy the same body. That child inherits 15 spirits from his mother's side and 15 spirits from its father's side. This is very important. In African culture, we are always taught about the human being is also a spirit being. You have a spirit. That's prevalent in the African culture. Now I know in European culture, they don't teach this. And I mean, they teach it in their religions, but they loosely teach it. But this is a reality, okay? So what does that mean? That means you inherit 15 spirits from your mother's side, 15 spirits from your father's side. And remember, the spirits is where you get your personality from. The spirits is where you get your personality from. So when you mix, now think about this. What we just said before, that the difference between the human races are the spirits. So Africans have distinct spirits. Asiatics have distinct spirits. And Caucasians have distinct spirits. So if the races mix, that means that child is going to have spirits from one parent and is going to have spirits from the other parent. So if you have a black father, it's going to have 15 black spirits from the father's side. And if you have a white mother, it's going to have 15 white spirits from the mother's side, like Barack Obama. Prime example. Well, what is the challenge with that? The challenge with that, remember, the spirits are the personality. And each race has its own distinct personality. So if you mix, like we've done, like the United States love to do, is promote mixed races. What that does is you bring in multiple conflicting personalities. Now, this is a very involved subject matter that I'm just touching the surface of, okay? And this is something the master teacher has been explaining for the last 50 years. It's a very complex subject matter that I'm getting into here, but it's something that is extremely important that we need to comprehend. We must comprehend this subject matter.
What's the purpose of comprehending this?
Because by comprehending this subject matter, then you can comprehend why do human beings behave the way they behave. Human beings can't figure out the different behaviors. It's simply because they don't understand that you're an incarnated spirit being who has a distinct personality. This is why black people have spent the last, 200 years trying to convince white people not to behave a certain way. We out there still telling white people, like this George Floyd incident, right? Stop killing us. When all they've been doing for the last 500 years is killing us consistently. Now, if somebody's been doing something for 500 years, generation to generation, then that should tell you that is that person's nature to behave a certain way. And by talking to them, protesting, that's not going to change their nature. Every species in nature, every animal species now, have its own distinct nature by nature. You have a lion, it has its nature by nature. You have a cow, it has its nature by nature. You have a dolphin, it has its nature by nature.
Before we keep going into the animal spirits and the animal natures,
right?
Can we address something on that? When we talk about our people trying to convince, Caucasians not to behave the way they behave because of their nature, what do you say to someone who asks the question, well, what about black people that's harming and killing black
people? Our original ancestors, or our original, how can I say? The original African. Mm-hmm. The original African is the Tahites, okay? The little ones. We call them, some people like, they call themselves the Mbuti, the Mbuti people of...
Who says that?
Yeah, that's their name, the Mbuti of South Africa, not South Africa, but Central Africa, the Congo. They call themselves the Mbuti, or you have names called the Twa or the Batwa, right? And you have the Sands of South Africa. Those are the original Africans that us tall Africans are descendants of. So here's the question. How is it that we come from the little ones, but we look so different from them today? Well, real simple. Because of what? Genetic mixing in. Genetic mixing in. So that's to say that if you study the Twa of the Congo, what you'll find in their nature is they have a very passive, agreeable, pleasant nature. They're not aggressive like the other Africans on the continent. They're not aggressive like that. So the question then comes, well, how did we go from being the Twa, the little ones, to being these tall Africans like the Watusis? We mixed out genes. And when you mix your genes, that's what I'm talking about. When you mix your genes with different races or species, you take on different spirits, and when you take on those different spirits, you take on different personalities. And you take on a personality that's maybe contrary to your original nature. So like I said, this is a very advanced subject matter that our people are highly ignorant of, that you must, and I say you must, learn about this subject matter, because the master teacher has been trying to explain this for the last 50 years. But who talks about it? You know what's interesting about it, when you study, when you go back to studying history, ancient history, you hear more about spirits. It is when you got to today in modern society, you don't hear no talk about this. And who's the cause of that? Caucasians in their educational system that try to take that type of information out of the education arena. Because the European culture didn't really deal with that type of subject matter. Doesn't mean it's not real. Doesn't mean it's not a reality. Other cultures to this day acknowledge it. The Chinese, the Asian culture, they highly acknowledge spirits. The Indians, to this very day, they acknowledge spirits. And Africans, those who haven't embraced European culture, acknowledge the existence of spirit beings. Okay? This is a reality. It's an actual fact. It's not a belief system. These are actual facts. It's just that our people, we used to be knowledgeable about it. We're not. And this is why we're teaching what we're teaching, Wu-Sabat. Anyone who have any questions on a subject matter, I highly recommend to ask your question in the study material that I've been recommending to give you more insight as to what this subject matter is all about. But let's move on, unless you have more questions.
Abrakazo Kromanya, Womunkazo, Oxudiasa, Unquasu, Nanama, Samanfo, Unquasu. But Yazafobra, as Samanfobra, see a Padu on a society as a four. And now the man Ababishai, as some said, don't want beg. I'm up at the Papa Maya. Unka omo no face abe unka omo no money abra omo nya twa ba hai. Omo unka ankasi ye kon ye twa ni yansa mabiem. Asu apratwira ofin. Fi abra aduma sai. Bra twetwuma ba hai. Omo ni ka kunom ha. Na fi omo nchi na omo ba beduru ase no. Omo ko ba kan ya ho na pa bi su fi ba bi ba. Bi su aso na nanom abra ka so ma nyina so. Abra oni pa bi o sa abra o gina ha.
Welcome to Rhythm and Justice Television with Brother Salim Adolfo. Today we are here with Professor James Small, and we're going to discuss different African traditional ceremonies and rituals. What you just saw was what we call a libation, and it was done in a village in West Africa, in Ghana to be specific. But Baba, can you tell the audience exactly what is a libation?
Yes, a libation is what an African do before they open any ceremony, before any other kind of prayers or discussion. They use spirits. It used to be palm wine, now they use a form of gin. We use over here water, and we pour it to the earth. They refer to the earth as a sasiya, Mother Earth.
Right.
And pouring it to the earth, we are pouring it to, first you raise it up to God Almighty, asking God Almighty, because all African cultures believe in a oneness of God. And after you've made the gesture to God Almighty, offering refreshments and drinks, then you pour it to the Mother Earth and to the ancestors, asking them to bless and guide whatever endeavor you're about to embark upon. You also pour to the forces of nature. In Ghana, they're called Obosun.
Okay.
In the Yoruba land, they call Orisha. In Haiti, they call Loas. But you're talking about the forces of nature, which in America they call the laws of physics. And so we know how to use and manipulate these energy forms. And so we pour to them in respect. We pour to our ancestors in respect, because all Africans who understand their culture realize that we are the ancestors. We are the DNA of millions upon millions of years and billions of ancestors culminate into us. And so when we pour that libation, we are appealing to our own consciousness as well as the collective consciousness to access the memory that is ancestry, so we can develop the imagination which is necessary to create the next movement or moment.
Now, oftentimes people try to say that this is something spooky, or this is that voodoo stuff and we're eating people and killing people. And I tell people with a libation, it's nothing more than what we see many people do all of the time. It's every time someone takes a drink, what they say, we're going to pour a little out for everybody who's not here.
Libation is mentioned in the document they call the Bible. They don't see our culture assimilated eating human beings, but their religious culture simulate eating the body of a human and drinking their blood. Our culture don't do that. We pay respects to the earth. We pay respects to the cosmos. We pay respects to the ancestors. We pay respects to divinity. We pay respects to the forces of nature, which comes from the divinity. The African word in every language for the divine, or for what we call the one God, is called the totality of creation itself. Okay.
Now, when we're talking about ancestral worship, I think that from my experiences in traditional African societies, that we do acknowledge the people who have gone on before us, but that is no different than what we see in some other spaces.
We don't worship our ancestors. We revere our ancestors because we are our ancestors. You are the culmination of the DNA of your mother and your father, and they were of the 4, their mothers and fathers.
Correct.
And they were of the 8, their mothers and fathers, and they were of the 16, and they were of the 32, and they were of the 64, etc. All of it culminate in you. You are they genetically, and you also they in terms of the emotions and the essence of the life, the vibrations and the sounds they made that impacted you.
Yes, sir.
So when we talk about revering our ancestors, we have in our systems, in the Yoruba system, a concept called Awo. We believe in all African cultures in reincarnation, that when we die, we are reborn again, not as an animal, not as a snake or a tree, but as a human being in the same family. In the Yoruba, we call it the Ibi, the same family unit that we first were born into the earth in. We constantly keep coming back in that unit, renewing that unit. And that each of us is an ancestor come back. And African Americans know this very well. especially in the South, anytime a child is born, we want to know who done come back now. Is this auntie so-and-so? Is this titty so-and-so? Is this mama so-and-so? Is this father so-and-so? So we retain that, and yet we reject it when we have to describe it, because we have been so imbued in the European way of worshiping God that we are afraid, even though they may not work for us very well, given our conditions in America. And I think there was a study done in Sweden twice in the last 20 years of who's the most religious worship in the world, and it's been deemed the African Americans. It doesn't seem like God is listening very well, or we're not talking the right language.
Right.
So maybe we need to show more respect for our mothers than our fathers, and maybe our days will be longer upon this earth which God has given thee. Because we have rejected our mothers and fathers, and our respect is towards the murderers and the rapists of our mothers and fathers. And we need to let that sink in.
Yes, sir.
Without getting confused.
Let's see. Some things I want to refer to. Actual facts. Patarak book I recommend is The Dimensional Shift. If you guys look into this particular book, it goes into the subject matter. Let's see, the actual facts, number 27, the supreme beings, the Melanite race, pages 47, paragraph 272, and it quotes, all the interbreeding with the Caucasian race is what is called, or who is called mankind, resulting in a lot of the chaos. It's one of the things we talked about, is it's not in our best interest to mix outside of your race. If you understood the science of spirits, if you understand the science of spirits, then you would know it's not in your best interest. Now, of course, in today's society, it's no big deal, because no one teaches the human being about the nature and what the human being really is. But that is what it is. Let's move on. Next point. If the human being is an incarnated spirit, then what happens to the spirit when the physical body dies? If the human being is an incarnated spirit, then what happens to the spirit when the physical body dies? Let's see, the spirit has one of three choices once it does not have a physical body. One, if you don't, as we say, sell your soul, you will resurrect to a higher dimensional life. Two, if you sell your soul, then you reincarnate back to earth to live a new life. Or three, if you are a negative person, then you run the chance of being a disembodied spirit who is destined to fade in time. So those are one of three things that can happen to an individual human being once you die. It's all relative to the lifestyle you live. Why we taught in African culture, we live by the principles of Ma'at. Now, I highly recommend guys to watch the lecture we did on that, the African system of justice, Ma'at. We did a lecture on that to give people some insight on that subject matter, so I recommend that. Now, spirits live off the blood of human beings. This is very important. Spirits live off the blood of human beings. When the blood flow stops, which is death, the spirit controlling the body leaves. Okay? This is why the goal of every student of Wu-Sabat are obligated to develop themselves spiritually so that they can learn how to make contact with higher dimensional beings who live on planets vibrating on a higher dimensional before you physically die. Now, in African culture, we always taught make contact with your ancestors. We always taught make contact with your ancestors. I repeat, we always taught make contact with your ancestors while you are alive. You see, you know, they put that in, what's that, the Black Panther movie with T'Challa? He was able to make contact with his ancestors while he was alive. Why? Because once one of your relatives passed, so-called died, they moved. If there was a positive being now, they moved into the ancestral realm, okay, which is a higher dimensional level of existence. that's very real. It's always been a part of African culture, okay? And it's a reality. It's definitely a reality. It's just that we're ignorant about this our culture ways.
Religion in Africa is a way of life for many. Humans have long had some kind of belief system. For thousands of years, Africans followed their traditional religions. In time, many abandoned these in favour of new ones. In this programme, we examine the indigenous religions of Africa and how these practices have endured. We look at Judaism and early Christianity. What was their influence on the continent and what impact did Africans have on these religions? There are many indigenous religions across Africa today, like Vodun, Orisha and Nkiche. They vary in practice from region to region, but share common features such as the idea in some higher and pervasive entity and force, which is manifested in everything that has been created now and in the future. The idea that ancestors exist in another world and can be invoked to intervene in our affairs. And prayers and sacrifices are made to intercessors so that a person's life on earth can be good and he or she can become an ancestor after death. Today, of Africa's 1 billion population, about 15% follow traditional religions. The rest are mostly Muslims and Christians. To find out more, I travel off the beaten track in southwestern Zimbabwe to meet a remote community in the Matobo Hills in Matabeleland with Zimbabwean culture expert Patisa Nyati. Patisa explains to me that these people are being trained in traditional spiritual practices.
This is spiritual elevation. They are under training. There are two things that are very important. Ululation, it's a show of reverence. And then secondly, they were mentioning the name of the ancestor. That's very important. So through ululating and also clapping hands. When you clap hands, you are showing reverence.
And it summons the spirit.
That's right. That's right. That's the whole purpose. What we are witnessing here is spirituality. It wasn't religion. It's not proper to call it religion. It's spirituality for us. But that spirituality is what ensured fertility of the soil and sustenance of the human race.
So just list for us then what those fundamental beliefs were, that power resided in nature, that there were gods present in trees, in plants, in the soil?
It all starts with the nature of person. When you look at me, what is my nature? Western society will see me as flesh, blood, and bones. For us, yes, all those are there. But more importantly, there is spirit. We believe, Africa believes in the soul, in the spirit. And the two are married. When I die, death is not the end. It's but the beginning of longer life, eternity. That's what Africa believes. This is why you're going to find death ceremonies, rituals are quite complex. They are meant to guide the spirit, going wherever it is going, perhaps to some constellation. Stars were very important. It's a pity that Africa is losing a knowledge of astronomy. Our forefathers were studying the stars because you learned a lot. Even during the night, stars will tell you how advanced the night was. So spiritualism has that basis. And then we had that ceremony, which we call bringing home ceremony, where you are inviting the departed spirit to come back, say after a year, to look after its progeny. So when I die, as a spirit, I'll come back to look after my own children. This was fundamental to African spirituality.
And your grandchildren and so on and so
That's
forth.
right.
And that just lasts forever and ever.
Forever and ever.
And you watch over them, make sure they have enough to eat, that they are successful.
Good life, good health, right? All that. So for us, spirituality was functional.
So these spiritual people here, men and women, help people connect with their departed ones. Is that what it is? And also veneration of nature.
Yes, because for us, without nature, you really can't talk of spirituality. It's all interwoven, interacted, interrelated. It's all one thing.
We became so Europeanized that we have lost sight of our ancestral ways. But let's move on. Now, in order to make contact, you must raise your vibration, aka the body's morphic resonance, to the level of the higher dimensional beings. These higher dimensional beings in today's society is nothing but ETs. So all this UFO stuff and all these people talking about the extraterrestrials and how extraterrestrials are coming to the planet Earth and interfacing with human beings. And mind you, the government now has admitted that UFOs, intelligent life forms, are real. Now we did a whole lecture on that. We did a whole lecture on the UFO subject matter. You guys can see that. I highly recommend you guys. In fact, you know what? Let's play the government, just the Pentagon. We talked about this before. Acknowledge the existence of UFOs. So listen to this.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you will, look right here.
Just when you thought 2020 couldn't get any more bizarre.
My gosh.
The Pentagon declassifying 3 videos of what they're calling unexplained aerial phenomena.
Look at that thing. It's rotating.
2 videos showing objects spotted by Navy fighter pilots during training flights in 2015. And this one from 2004 showing an object about 40 feet long hovering about 50 feet above the water. Weird, right? Well, get this. The videos were previously leaked by a private company founded by Blink-182 rocker Tom DeLonge. The singer tweeting on Monday, "The Pentagon just officially released my videos." Just saying. So why are they being released now? A spokesperson saying, after a thorough review, the department has determined that the authorized release of these unclassified videos does not reveal any sensitive capabilities or systems. DoD is releasing the videos in order to clear up any misconceptions by the public on whether or not the footage that has been circulating was real. Harry Reid, former senator of Nevada, home to the infamous Area 51, tweeting, "I'm glad the Pentagon is finally releasing this footage, but it only scratches the surface of research and materials available." But the DoD not offering much more info, saying the aerial phenomena observed in the videos remains characterized as unidentified. Retired Navy Commander David Fravor was piloting the jet in the 2004 video.
And it's moving around left, right, forward, back. The radar immediately starts getting jammed. All of a sudden, it takes off.
A mystery of galactic proportions.
There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA.
Okay, so now you heard it from them, right? White man says that UFOs are a real phenomenon. I hope you now can accept that. Well, I'm here. What I'm trying to tell you, when Africans talked about spirit beings, really it was just talking about advanced humanoids, which are nothing but what people will call ETs, beings that are living on more advanced societies, more advanced galaxies, whatever. But let me go on. Okay, now, it is our goal as students of Wu-Sabat not to believe in higher dimensional beings and higher dimensional worlds. Our objective has always been proving the existence of this reality through your own personal experience by raising your own personal vibration to be able to make contact. Now, we taught this. We've taught, the master teacher actually have taught for 50 years how to make contact. You don't believe in this subject matter. You must know that this is a reality. Okay? I refer all. We put out the master in our for all students of Wu-Sabat, we all know this, that the master, we have our spiritual orders. The first spiritual order the master teacher introduced us to was the Sons of the Green Light, and he introduced that to us back in the 80s. And then he introduced us in the 90s to the ancient mystic order of Melchizedek. And that's something he introduced us to in the 90s. And you guys will see images of those things, right? And then now, the last spiritual order he introduced us to is the ancient Egyptian order. The ancient Egyptian order. So all three of these orders dealt with re-educating the human being about their spiritual nature. I repeat, all three of these spiritual orders were dedicated to re-educating the human being about their spiritual nature. Okay? Let's see. I also recommend the book we put out, Master Secrets number 19. This one, The Spiritual You After the Physical You Die, explains the different things that can happen to a spirit once the physical body dies. So what I was telling about the three things that can happen, this book goes into that subject matter, so I highly recommend that. The next thing is, I want you to listen to CD, the other CD I recommended before. I want you to listen to this. The master kind of goes into the subject matter, is the Angelic Descendants CD. And listen to, he's going to explain here that we are what the human being is. Human beings are basically fallen spirit beings who must work to perfect themselves, or aka raise your morphic field, so that we would be able to live on higher dimensional worlds. So I want you to listen to him talk about that.
Okay. Another question. I heard one of your tapes, and it said on there that you have sons of Allah, and they don't know that they're sons of Allah.
You are a son of Allah,
right?
And you're having a hard time understanding. Let me tell you what I mean. The light shineth in the darkness, yet the darkness comprehendeth it not. There was a man sent from Allah whose name was John. You see that?
Yes.
Now, how that happened? Take John the Baptist. When John the Baptist was questioned by the Jews, as they called him then, as to whether or not he was the Messiah, he said he wasn't. Correct?
Right.
They also asked him, was he that prophet? What did he say? He's not. Then they asked him, was he Elijah? And what did he say? No. Later on, Jesus came along and told him and told the disciples that John the Baptist, Johanna, was indeed the return of Elijah. Now here is a man who was a prophet called John the Baptist, called a prophet, receiving revelations and inspiration from the Almighty. And when questioned of whether or not he was John the Baptist, he said no. By the time it gets to Matthew 17, 10 through 13, he finds out through Jesus that he is. So the answer is, you can have a divine spirit moving in you and you not know it, because you don't tune your body in. This is why human beings get sick. Human beings get sick because their body becomes untuned, just like an automobile. If your car is not properly tuned and the pistons and stuff are not functioning properly, the car will malfunction, correct? Right. Well, the human being also has a tuning process. He must stay in tune. Prayer, meditation are the things that keeps the human body in tune. He plugs into the source. If he does not keep himself in tune with the spiritual world, he becomes sick physically. You understand? Yes. So that means that the spirit can be moving in man and man not be fully aware of it. All ye are sons of the Most High, thusly you all are angelic beings. When you break down the word angelic being, when you go to the English definition, to the Latin and Greek, you come out with the word messenger. When you go to the Arabic word malaika, you come to one full of something, to be complete or full. Mahu. You follow that? Yeah. A complete being. When you were in your spiritual state, you were a complete being. When you became a mortal and slipped from grace, you became a broken being, incomplete. And then the Almighty said, you must perfect yourself or correct yourself. In the language of the scripture, this is called salihin, those who correct or fix themselves or work for perfection and righteousness. Yeah. You follow that? Yeah.
Okay, so now you heard him explain that phenomenon that's always been a part of our teachings as well. In the same lecture, first of all, I recommend people take your time, listen to that whole lecture, because that whole lecture, the angelic descendants, is extraordinarily profound. And mind you, that was something we did in the 1980s. Okay, there's another part of the lecture. He explains that we must resurrect so that we can live like what religious people call angels, and we identify today in today's culture as ETs. And this is one of the goals in which we teach in our doctrine. So I want you guys also to listen to that part where he goes into about the goal of the human being is to raise yourself back into those realms, to raise yourself spiritually so that you can interface with those realms or those dimensions. So listen to that.
And those of you who perfect themselves and make the transition from a mortal into a supernatural being or back into an angelic state and will get the opportunity to travel into other galaxies, you will be amazed. Because once you make the transition, remember, the first thing you inherit at the day of resurrection is life eternal. The same thing that the devil promised you in the beginning, that in the day you eat thereof, your eyes shall be open and you shall be as God. He knew what he was talking about. He was deceiving us in one way because he was trying to make us violate the commandments of the Most High. But on the other hand, as an angel, he knew what he was talking about. You see? And the day will come that those people who recognize the violation of the commandments of the Almighty by partaking of that forbidden fruit and reject the fruits of the devil and reject the things of the devil and take on the Messiahship. Because Messiahship or Christ is a nature that you all must succumb to. There's great masters or beings called Elohim in the beginning of Genesis. When they say in the beginning was the word, they use the word Elohim. Elohim is a Hebrew word which is Elo in a plural. These Elohim are what they refer to as the we or the Lord of hosts, the angelic beings. They are overseeing. They come into your plane at different periods of time to interfere with what man is doing to try to coerce him. Those of you who accept the teachings into themselves will be transformed back into, again, angelic beings, and you will witness the heavens. You'll see angelic beings, and you'll travel other galaxies. Those of you that can make that height.
Okay, so you heard that. I hope that gives you guys some insight into the subject matter, right? About, mind you, this subject, this discussion is about the races of nature by nature, aka what is a human being, right? And so we're trying to explain that the human being is an incarnated spirit being. You can't comprehend the races unless you can comprehend what the human being is. And you can't comprehend what the human being is unless you come to acknowledge that the human being is an incarnated spirit being.
Just as a recap, what is the importance of this subject matter in today's world? Like everything that's going on, how can this information help?
You can't comprehend a human being unless you can comprehend the nature and essence of what the human being is. All human beings are doing today are trying to relate to one another. Why is there chaos in the world? Because human beings don't know how to relate to one another because they don't understand their nature. If we really understood our nature and how we should behave in harmony with nature, we wouldn't be doing the things we're doing. But it's because of the supreme ignorance on what a human being is why the world is in chaos. Literally. Now we've been arguing it's because of the Caucasian have conquered the planet. And they have dominated the planet with their culture. And their culture is based on ignorance to nature. And so when you have a dominant ruling culture and that dominant ruling culture is ignorant to nature, then you're going to have world chaos because where do everyone come from? We all come from nature. So how could you be ignorant to that which created you? But unfortunately, we live in a culture that literally ignores the existence of nature and how nature works and functions. Now, what's ironic about it is that the so-called European scientific community, their whole goal has been to comprehend nature. That's what science is all about, studying nature, right? But what's the problem with their science? They only are interested in studying the parts of nature that can give them an economic advantage, a military advantage, or a psychological advantage on other human beings. They don't care about how to study nature and how human beings could be in harmony with nature. That's not what they use their science for. They use their science to study nature to get advantages to advance their society. This is one of the mistakes that I get on what's those brothers, the Mirage Squad and them, because they keep talking about the science, man. Science, you gotta be science, you gotta be science. And it's like you're following the pattern of the Caucasian. That's why their science neglects what? The metaphysical sciences. They don't deal with the metaphysical sciences. What is metaphysical? That which is beyond the physical. Now, what's funny about it is if you ask a scientist, do you deal with metaphysics? And they'll say no, right? And then you ask, well, what kind of scientist are you? And they say, oh, I study quantum mechanics. Well, what the heck is quantum mechanics? That's metaphysics. That's beyond the physical. It's before the physical, meaning before the hydrogen atoms, subatomic particles, dealing with the existence of subatomic particles and how subatomic energies affecting humanity, affecting atomic particles. The whole quantum field or quantum mechanics science division, all they're talking about is the metaphysical aspect of science. So it's kind of ridiculous when you do ask them that question. They'll sit there and say, no, we don't study metaphysics. And they really do. It's just that people don't understand the language.
There are some points that I want to say that are directly relevant to the United Nations and to world culture. And maybe the most concrete way to say it is that this is probably the first time, in fact it is the first time in my entire life that I ever sat on a panel outside of specialty conferences that are just about consciousness, which are considered very marginal and do not have mainstream acceptance. This is the first elite location probably that has ever occurred where people like this can sit in front of an audience like this and say what we've said about how the fact that materialism is not true and the mind as a non-material force through focused attention can change the brain. It is radically new that we can sit here and tell you this. It has never happened before. And I want to stress another point. It's really, I can't, you know, seeing Leo DiCaprio, who I worked extremely closely with, I mean, again, if I had the time, even just that one scene that they showed of, he was portraying Howard Hughes, a man whose life was ruined by obsessive-compulsive disorder, and we spent hours and hours and hours just on that one little segment that you just watched, working together to get all the nuances right, and I wish I had the time to tell you more about that, and then how Martin Scorsese synergized the process. And it was a very, very interesting thing. And again, I'm just so happy that you could see that little piece of that. And maybe I'll tell one fast anecdote about Leo DiCaprio that'll kind of lead into where I'm going here, and really does make the point. Leo DiCaprio so immersed himself into that role. And on the other, there's another 15-minute video after this one that you saw in which I talk about Mario's work in terms of how the mind can change serotonin and how actors, when they portray a role, actually change how their neurochemistry works. And he did this spectacular work in his laboratory showing that when actors portray a role, they change how the serotonin in their brain works. And to bring that point home to real life, Leo DiCaprio so immersed himself in this role to portray it and worked so closely and was so dedicated. I mean, the nuances that he wanted to integrate into the performance, and that I very much believe he did integrate into the performance, resulted in the fact that for 3 months after the filming was stopped, he could not stop having obsessive-compulsive disorder. So he actually induced in his own brain a transient case of obsessive-compulsive disorder, which took several months for him to sort of recover from. And if that doesn't tell you how powerfully the mind can affect the brain and how much an actor can immerse themselves in a role, that it takes 3 months after the shooting is done to get out of the role and stop having obsessive-compulsive thoughts, feelings, and symptoms, that is, I think itself is just a very, very powerful way of understanding how much focused attention can change the brain. And I want to say one other thing, just to contextualize this for you. You know, we've had some sort of very polite and, you know, lady and gentlemanly comment about the struggles we've all been through. We've been through intense struggles. Every one of us has paid serious career prices for the choices that we've made to say that the materialist paradigm needs to change. And Henry just so eloquently, and I'm years of refinement that it's taken for him to take this very, very complex mathematics that he understands like very, very few people who have ever lived, and be able to talk to a lay audience and describe it in such clear terms has taken a huge amount of additional labor for him that he had focused his own attention on. But I need to tell you, because he never would, because he's too humble, that as cogent as what he was just saying to you is, and as necessary it is for us as a world community to translate our paradigm of understanding the relationship between consciousness and the body, consciousness and the brain, in ways that Henry just described, so that we can understand how focused attention changes our brain. Henry's view of quantum physics, which is the orthodox view, which is the view of the founders of the field of quantum mechanics, and let me stress this third point because it's the most important one, is the only way that quantum mechanics can actually be done. It's the only way that you can actually collect data in physical experiments that's ever been known and ever been actually practiced. And yet for all of that, very, very few physicists would sign off on what Henry just said. It's considered extremely controversial. And why? Because everybody in the scientific establishment is so dedicated. And in fact, they're following Albert Einstein in this because Albert Einstein radically disagreed with what he just said. And Albert Einstein went to his grave not believing that the Heisenberg uncertainty principle was an actual principle of nature. He thought it was just a stopgap measure. And so we are still, as a community of a small minority of scientists who want to overcome this materialist paradigm, struggling with our lives, our careers suffer, our incomes radically suffer. We don't get anything like the kind of recognition from the mainstream media that the materialist community gets. So, I mean, it is an incredible honor to be here. It's also an incredible opportunity to be here. But I have to tell you that we are, you know, a small drop in the bucket still as we speak today. There is huge resistance among the mainstream scientific elite against granting the fact that materialism is not the ultimate truth. And let me say one thing, and then I'll bring this to a conclusion about why that's true. Because if what we're telling you up here turns out to be the case, and I think that already there's such a large amount of data that I think it straightforwardly is the case. And as I'm saying, as we sit here right now, it's still the only way the quantum mechanics can be done, and yet they still will do anything to deny that that's the case. And why? Yes, there are economic reasons. I have what I would call a balanced and pretty neutral view of the pharmaceutical industry. I am not anti-pharmaceutical industry, and I am not anti-drug, although my opponents try to describe me as that. It's not the case. But just the fact that I want to use pharmaceutical agents, that I want to use psychiatric medicines as a way to enable people's capacity to focus their attention more effectively so that they are enabled to change their brain, that view of using pharmaceutical agents, which I think most people would just say is common sense, of course that's what we should be doing, is considered radical, considered anti-establishment, and the notion of psychiatric drugs, and now they want to put electrodes and are putting electrodes in people's brains, even though the neuroanatomy is not understood at any level that would justify putting electrodes in people's brains to treat psychiatric disorders. And yet it's being done, and it's being aggressively pushed by industry, by basically a collaboration of industry and elite science who want to, on the one hand, push the materialist paradigm, and on the other hand, want to obviously make significant profits from the sale of these medical devices. And the point I'm making is this. Yes, on one hand, we're up against economic forces. On one hand, the materialist paradigm is viewed as, in some way, a key to how free enterprise economics operates. And it's certainly viewed as the key to how science operates.
So, I repeat, let me just reiterate. Guys, listen to that CD. I highly recommend you guys listen to that CD, Angelic Descendants. I highly recommend studying that CD. Not just listen to it, but study that tape. That's a very profound, especially with the current actual facts that we're putting out, the books that I've been recommending, but also study certain lectures, like the other lecture, Who and What Are You? So we'll post that so you guys can see that. Study that lecture too. Who and What Are You? Study the Angelic Descendants. There's another lecture the master teacher did, and this is back in the 80s. What is a human being? Study that lecture also. Very important. Let me move on. Next point. Now, did African ancestors teach about resurrection and making contact with higher dimensional worlds of their ancestors? I repeat, did African ancestors teach about resurrection and making contact with higher dimensional worlds of their ancestors? First thing I say is this. Read the Bible. If you go to the Bible, let's see, Matthew chapter 6, verse 22. Read that. Also go to the book of John, chapter 1, very beginning, right? All of those particular quotes are dealing with spiritual development, right? If you go to the Quran, read the Quran, chapter 103. okay, talks about those particular quotes, talks about resurrection, which are most likely copied from Egyptian and Sumerian sources. So there's a lot of spiritual references in the Bible. Now we know that the Bible as we know it came from the Romans as well as the Greeks. And anyone who studies the Caucasian, they don't have a spiritual science. There's nothing spiritual about them. And that's one of the issues I have, again, with the Amara Squad, because I was listening to one of the brothers on their talking about, they keep saying this weird things, that black people today who talk about metaphysics, we got that from Caucasians like Madam Blavatsky. Now look at the picture of this one, Madam Blavatsky. They got the nerve to say that any black person who's talking about metaphysics is getting it from a Caucasian. That's a bold-faced lie.
You know, that's what that is. That's what that is. So yeah.
So the pro-white, the reality situation is, if you take a deep dive into what they're teaching in the conscious community about the astral projection, that's Madame Blavatsky. All right, look up Madame Blavatsky. She started the Theocratical Society. She went to India and she learned from some mystics, and they bring that nonsense back. Okay, so the conscious community is actually riding on the coattails of people like David Icke, Madame Blavatsky, all these white people that's been discarded out of their own community. Dal Bigtree, you know what I'm saying? That nobody listens to them. Nobody, because they have been
saying that the information being put forth is pro-white and against the best interest.
All right, it's big as day. All right, it says 23 hours ago, Wujau Irimaat, which is me. I made this post with a picture of Madame Blavatsky, and I said, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the master teacher of the conscious community. Now, I always put conscious community in quotation marks, and I do that for a reason. But I said, people think Russia interfered with the 2016 U.S. presidential elections. But guess what? They've been the best friend of the conscious community for decades. Most of what people in the conscious community practice or gravitate towards is connected to this woman and Theosophy or the Theosophical Society. Now I'm going to read that again. I said most of what people in the conscious community practice or gravitate towards is connected to this woman and the Theosophy or the Theosophical Society, from which she's a co-founder of. All right. Nowhere in my post did I say that this woman is the creator or originator of anything whatsoever. But for some reason, people are reading into this post as though I did say that. So again, I said most of what people in the conscious community practice or gravitate towards is connected to this woman.
That's a bold-faced lie. This is something I had taught before and put out there for the general public to know. We, as students of the master teacher, the first part of our movement back in the 70s and the 80s, we identified ourselves as Ansars. Okay, see a picture of us as Ansars? We identify ourselves as Ansars who come out of the Sudan. The Ansars of the Sudan were Sufi Muslims, are Sufi Muslims. Anyone who knows anything about Sufi Islam, the whole culture is about spiritual development. That's what it means to be a Sufi. The goal of a Sufi is to become one with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Which is one of the reasons why if anyone who studies anything about Sufis, they're the ones persecuted by your Orthodox Muslims. They don't like Sufis because they argue Sufis are not really Muslims. Now, if you study, here's a guy by the name of Mustafa Gandala that those guys are aware of. He put out a book and he was trying to, this is a native Egyptian who's trying to explain that Sufism is an offshoot from the Egyptian mysteries. And that the reason why the Egyptian priests and the spiritual practices in Egypt, they how can I say, they camouflage their culture through Islamic Sufism to stop being persecuted when the Arabs, Pale Arabs, invaded Egypt and forced their culture on the Egyptian people. Okay? And so what I'm trying to say is that anyone who really studies Sufism, you know that Sufism comes out of ancient Egypt, ancient African spiritual sciences and cultures. So no, we did not get our spiritual teachings from some Caucasians. Those same Caucasians were studying in Africa and they got it from Africans. Period. So it's an insult for people to think that. Anytime individuals like ourselves who teach about spiritual development. So I'm letting you guys know the facts. In fact, the first Sufi was a guy by the name of Dhul Nun. Dhul Nun, who is a native Egyptian. He was a native Egyptian who taught about what? Alchemy. Who taught about the ancient Egyptian scientists. He was born in one of the cities that are called I believe it's called Akhmim. And some say this is where the name Kemet and alchemy comes from, that particular city that's in Egypt to this very day. Okay? But this brother was an African. He was black and he was a native Egyptian and he was supposedly the first Sufi. So the first Sufi just so happened to be an African, black African Egyptian. What a coincidence. And everyone knows, anyone who knows about our culture and about the master teacher knows that our original doctrine we were teaching was Ansar doctrine, which is Sufi teachings coming out of the Sudan and Egypt. So anyone who tries to tell you some lie that we got our spiritual knowledge from some Caucasians, that's a bold-faced lie. Not to mention, most of those Caucasians, like I said, were plagiarizing from Africans. There's nothing, anyone who knows anything about the Caucasians, you know they're not spiritual. There's nothing spiritual about them or their culture. But let's move on. So I just wanted to say that that point is very important. Here's another thing. When you study our ancient Egyptian culture, the whole culture is based on resurrection. What do you think the Asar Aset story in Haru is all about? It's about resurrection.
We said that we were going to talk about spirituality and where you are spiritually. Can you explain that to us? As it's sort of hard to ask the question, to frame the question, because you have to have a point of reference.
No, I got a point of reference, man.
All right, well, let's go.
I got a point of reference. Life. Right. Life. We all got to deal with life.
My son just died 2 weeks ago, right? And you know, this is my stepson. I hate using the word stepson. This is my daughter's brother. You remember my daughter, Atlantis, right? And as I'm preparing her for his death, you know, he had a stroke 30 months ago and was hospitalized, paralyzed, was on dialysis. So I knew that that he wasn't going to make it, and I knew that his quality of life was gone, and that his only way out was death, and that death was not the end. Death is a doorway to the next life, and that we had to prepare ourselves to release him for his sake. And so it's about us understanding that there is life after life. And the only reason I can have this quality of conversation with my daughter is because she's been with me in this tomb for the last 10 years. We've been in these burial chambers, man, finding some incredible things, having very serious daddy-daughter conversations about how is it that I'm not a licensed Egyptologist, I'm not an archaeologist, but how is it that I'm here finding these things? I mean, what is it that my life dictated that I follow this path and that she's here following this path with me, you know? So understanding, to me, what life is all about. And this is a continuation of the process because my mother passed 5 years ago, right? And my mother passed at home. It was home hospice. You know, she didn't want to be in the hospital dying. And so my daughter and I were there caring for her last weeks of life, and we were at her bedside when she took her last breath, you know, and to be able to prepare the way for her soul based on what I know from studying African history, that, you know, when your physical body expires, your soul goes on to another level, and there's specific things that you can do in order to prepare the soul to leave the body and go to this place. You know, you see in Egyptian papyri and what have you, this scene of the weighing of the soul, where the soul has to go into the double hall of Ma'at and declare their innocence by reciting 42 admonitions of Ma'at, which is just a means by which you can model your life, because not everybody can live up to all these 42 declarations of innocence, but it's just a platform, you know, to model your life after, so that when this time comes, you can say that I have not robbed, I have not stolen, I have not defrauded offerings, I have not done these things, and then your heart could be as light as a feather. And then you can be prepared to move into the next phase of your existence. So my mother passed on October the 30th in 2015, and then 46 days later, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing has a stroke. And I'm in her hospital room when she's on life support, and her sister Lauren says, you know, Frances would not want to be hooked up to this monitor. You know, she didn't believe that when you died, that was the end. She believed that we came back, and there's something that we should do. So there were about 6 of us in the room, and there was a sister, a good friend of mine, who's an Akan priestess. So she said, look, there are things that we can do to pave the way for her soul to leave her body. And we set things up in this room, and we prayed, and we chanted, and we released her soul, and we invited the soul of her parents and her grandparents to be there to receive her. So, you know, when you can take these abstract things that we've been reading about in history, and I've been studying about traveling to Egypt, and put them into practical application, right? When you prepare somebody that you love to leave the physical world and go into the ancestral realm and open the door for them, then that's a powerful thing. And so, as I said, I've come to understand that there is no death. There's only life after life, and that life is a continuum. And when you understand this, it makes you see everything differently. When you know that, you know, how you treat somebody in this life is going to determine how you're going to be treated in the next life. It makes you want to do right. It makes you want to do good. So when you call me, man, and ask me questions, I'm obligated to talk to you, man, because one, you're asking me for advice, guidance, and wisdom, which I have, which I've been preparing myself to receive, and now you're coming to me, so I have an obligation to share this information with you because I know you're going to share it with somebody else. So I'm creating all this positive karma, man, that's going to make life better for me. It's going to make life better for you. It's going to make life better for everybody who's within our sphere, and that's how you play this thing forward. That's how you neutralize racism and ignorance and all these things that we're dealing with in this lifetime in order to make sure that when we come back, we at a higher plane, man, and we can function on another level and create the world that we were born to create.
This is very important to understand what a human being is, what our nature is, what our purpose is, and how the different races came about. Again, like I said, I'm only touching the surface of this subject matter. I'm only touching the surface of this subject matter because there's so much more to explain. But again, what I want to do is just introduce the concepts to the general public. Okay, because the general public is not aware of this type of information. So definitely, if you study our Egyptian culture, you will realize the Egyptian culture was about, as we said, resurrection. This is one of the reasons why they accuse the Egyptians with being obsessed with death. They was not obsessed with death. That's what the Caucasians like to teach. No, they was obsessed with life. They were obsessed with moving from one dimension into a higher dimensional existence. That's what they were obsessed with. Okay? So, last point is this. Why isn't this information taught in popular culture, and what can you do to fix yourself, right? So why isn't this information taught in popular culture, and what can you do to fix yourself? Well, answer. What we teach is liberation affirmation, which is unfortunately outlawed in Western culture, meaning that your oppressor will never teach the oppressed the information they need to liberate themselves from the oppressor. I repeat, the oppressor would never teach the oppressed liberation information that the oppressed needs to liberate themselves from the oppressor. It's backwards. They'll never teach you this kind of information. So this is one of the reasons why you'll never learn about it here. Because spiritual knowledge is the key to solving the problem that humanity is dealing with. Spiritual knowledge is the key to solving the problem that humanity is dealing with. Next.
How is that, before you move on? If we're in a physical world.
The human being is an incarnated spirit being. You're not just in a material world, but you're also in an energy world. Spirit means energy. Spirit means energy. Okay? Spirit means energy. The human body runs off energy. Spirit energy.
Materialism is an ancient philosophy. It dates back to the ancient Greeks, and the viewpoint of Democritus, who was a Greek philosopher, is that the only thing that exists is atoms in the void, and that everything, including the human mind, is reducible to atoms in the void. And in the 20th century, the materialist ideas have been extended a bit. The behaviorists in the early 20th century believed that the mind was at best irrelevant and possibly didn't even really exist at all. And the only thing that actually mattered was the behavior of a human being or the behavior of an organism. That philosophical viewpoint turned out to be untenable. So the viewpoint that the mind was identical to the brain became widely accepted among materialists in the 1960s and 70s. It was called identity theory. And that viewpoint has come to be untenable. Pretty obviously, the mind is not the same thing as the brain. And other theories such as functionalism, which views the mind-brain relationship somewhat akin to the relationship between the software and the hardware of a computer, has become quite popular, but the mind is not computation. In fact, the mind is the opposite of computation, although the brain itself could be described as a computer. The mind is no form of computation. And a theory that is currently very popular among materialists is called eliminative materialism. And eliminative materialism is the viewpoint that there is no such thing as the mind. It's not that the mind is explainable by matter, it's just that the mind doesn't exist at all. And the only thing that exists is matter, and that we are deluded into thinking we have minds. That's a rather radical, strange way to look at things, but it actually is rather popular nowadays amongst materialists. None of these philosophical materialist viewpoints have any particular support in science. The scientific evidence strongly suggests that these viewpoints are wrong. There are a variety of classic studies in neuroscience that support the viewpoint that some aspects of the mind are not material and that refute materialism. The first set of experiments are experiments that show cerebral localization with certain kinds of neurological functions, but not with others. It's been known since the 19th century that for motor and sensory function, there are very specific locations in the brain that seem to mediate those functions. What if I move my hand? That is controlled by a specific part of my opposite cerebral hemisphere, and the area is quite discrete. Vision is controlled by a very discrete area in the occipital lobes. However, higher intellectual functions, abstract thought, such as mathematics, such as contemplating ethics, things involved in personality, are not localized like that. That is, that there is no calculus center of my brain. There's no addition center of my brain. The brain seems to be necessary, ordinarily, for doing calculus and doing addition and thinking about concepts like justice and mercy and so on. But it's not localizable in any way near the same way that movement and sense and sensation is localizable. The belief that higher abstract thought was going to be localizable was held by materialists in the 19th century, and they developed the theory of phrenology from that. There's the idea that all of these individual higher intellectual functions had a spot in the brain that controlled them, and phrenology, of course, has been discredited. It's been shown to be wrong. And it was wrong because only certain things in the brain seem to be mediated by the brain. Other aspects of the mind don't have a spot in the brain that seems to give rise to them. The implication there is that they're not really material, that they're an immaterial power of being able to reason and use logic. And frankly, that's a very old dualist idea. It was an idea proposed by Aristotle, an idea as part of Thomistic philosophy. So for thousands of years, dualists have predicted that, and modern neuroscience confirms that. Back in the 1960s, Roger Sperry, who is a prominent neuroscientist, did a series of studies on patients who had had split brain operations. And these are patients who had severe epilepsy, in which an epileptic focus would begin in one hemisphere of the brain and travel through the corpus callosum, which is a bundle of fibers connecting the two hemispheres, and cause a generalized seizure. It was recognized by surgeons in the mid-20th century that if you cut the fiber bundle that connected the two hemispheres of the brain, that you could prevent the seizures from becoming generalized, and you could greatly improve the quality of the patient's life. So a number of patients had this operation called corpus callosotomy. It's an operation that I've performed and that many neurosurgeons have performed. And surprisingly, after the operation, the patients, their seizures would get better, of course, but they really weren't much different. That is, that their brains were essentially cut in half, but they still seemed to be a unitary person. They still seemed to be fairly normal. Sperry was a neuroscientist who studied these people in detail, and he did find that there were some subtle abnormalities as a result of cutting the brain in half. But the abnormalities were very subtle. They were so subtle that the experiments he did won him the Nobel Prize. But they weren't obvious. They weren't obvious changes. And what that implies is that the human mind is not purely generated by the matter of the brain. Otherwise, cutting the brain in half would have profound effects on the human mind. It might make two people. Certainly, it would create a rather profound difference in a person's state of consciousness, and it doesn't. You can cut the brain in half, and the person can't tell the difference except that he has fewer seizures. There are some subtle differences, but the differences can only be detected with literally Nobel Prize winning research that shows little differences in perception.
By being ignorant to your true nature, it is the reason why humans are in a state of chaos, because the only way to have harmony is to be in harmony with nature and not destroy the earth and each other. And humans are doing both. They're destroying the earth and they're destroying each other. Well, why is that? Because they're ignorant to their nature. They're ignorant that they are nothing but a product of nature. And once you become knowledgeable about nature and about your nature, your original nature, then you will live in harmony with nature like all the other species on earth. That's why no other species on earth has to go to school, because a fish knows how to be a fish. A bird knows how to be a bird. A monkey knows how to be a monkey. It's just human beings don't know how to act and how to treat the earth. Because why? Human beings got away from overstanding their nature. Now that's a whole nother question. Well, how did that happen? You know, how did we forget? That in itself is a lesson all to itself, and that's something we have been teaching as students of the master teacher. We have been explaining those actual facts, which is why we've had so many books, and you see me recommending so many books. The goal here is not to take what we say as facts. The goal is to research what we're teaching, the facts, so that you would know for yourself that these are not claims. These are actual facts, but you have to study, right? You have to study. What's the saying? If you want to keep something from a Negro, what do?
Put it in a book.
Because we hate to read. We hate to read. We hate to study. We hate to study. It's sad, but it's a reality. But with that being said, it's a lot of information. I hope it's edifying for you guys. We have so much more to go. We're not going to take as long as we've done before to put these lectures out. We have so many lectures that's up and coming. So definitely stay tuned. Also, we're preparing to do NoopooH live. So we're going to be Noopoo live. So we're going to go live so that people can interface with us, do question and answer. That's coming soon. Give or take a couple of months, right? By the fall, we should have that set up where we can do a live question and answer. So hopefully we can address some direct concerns that people may have about what we're teaching. But I repeat, watch our lectures more than once. I repeat, look at study the material we recommend for you guys to read, okay? Don't just watch one of our lectures, watch all our lectures, because it's a conglomeration of information that leads to one common thought. It is a conglomeration of information that leads to one common thought. And that common thought is resurrection, to fix yourself, to correct yourself. And so I thank you, right? I bless you. Support, right? Become a member, subscribe. Also, we forgetting to tell people, hit that bell, because that lets people, gives you notification when we do post a lecture. So definitely hit that YouTube bell. That's extremely important. And we say bless and peace to all. Wadu.
going there.